The paper hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot. Lenora Langley stood across from Sheriff Graham Maddox in the cramped, wood-paneled office that smelled of tobacco and dried leather, and she watched his jaw tighten as he looked at the deed she had just slammed down in front of him. His gray eyes, sharp and unforgiving as flint, moved from the document to her face and back again, and what she saw in those eyes made her stomach turn cold. Not curiosity, not concern, doubt. The deep, settled kind that had already made its verdict before the evidence was heard. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that slow, deliberate cadence of a man who had grown accustomed to being obeyed, "I have no reason to question the legitimacy of a deed that has already been filed, witnessed, and stamped by this county's land office." "Then you have no reason to throw a widow and her daughter off land they have worked for 11 years, Lenora said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a raised voice gave men like Graham Maddox exactly the excuse they needed to stop listening. He leaned back in his chair, and the wood groaned under the weight of him. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of frame that had been shaped by hard labor and harder choices. The silver star pinned to his chest caught the afternoon light filtering through the dusty window. "The deed is in order. It's got the right stamps, the right signatures, the right date of filing. The widow Calloway is disputing a legal transaction." "The deed is forged," Lenora said. The room went very quiet. She watched something flash across his face. It was not anger exactly. It was something closer to the look a man gets when he is being talked to by someone he has already decided does not know what they are talking about, and every word coming out of their mouth only confirms it. "And you know this because I am a cartographer and a document examiner," Lenora said. "I have spent the last 9 years traveling the Western Territories, surveying land boundaries for the federal government and authenticating land records for the Department of the Interior. I know what a forged deed looks like, Sheriff. I have seen dozens of them." He said nothing. "This one," she continued, keeping her voice level, "is particularly clever. Whoever made it knew enough about the process to get the paper weight right, to age the ink, and to replicate the county seal with reasonable accuracy. But they made 3 mistakes that no forger ever avoids, and if you give me 48 hours and access to your land office records, I will prove it to you in terms even a lawman with no particular interest in believing me cannot argue with." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Graham Maddox looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her, the way he had not quite allowed himself to do since she had walked through his door that morning, dusty from 2 days on the road, with a leather satchel over her shoulder, and a directness in her eyes that he had not seen in a woman, or a man for that matter, in longer than he could easily recall. She was perhaps 28 or 29, dark-haired and lean, with ink stains on the edge of her right hand and a compass on a chain around her neck that she wore with the same unconscious habit most women wore a locket. "You have 24 hours, he said. She had not expected even that much. "I will need access to the land office records going back 5 years. I will arrange it, and I will need the original deed, not a copy." His jaw tightened again. "I will have to take that up with the county recorder." "Then I suggest you do it quickly," she said, and picked up her satchel. "Because Hector Vane's men are coming back to the Calloway property at sunrise tomorrow to begin eviction, and by the time they finish, any evidence of what was done to that family will be buried under new construction and a very convincing story." She walked out of his office into the dry, blazing heat of a Dust Creek afternoon, and she did not look back. She had been 3 days' ride from Dust Creek, Nevada, when she had heard the story. It was the autumn of 1882, and Lenora Langley had been traveling the Nevada Territory for the better part of 2 months, completing a survey contract for the federal land office in Carson City. The work suited her. It always had. She had grown up in Philadelphia with a father who was a professional surveyor, and a mother who had taught her mathematics and Latin before most girls her age had learned to read. And by the time she was 19, she had been accompanying her father on survey expeditions across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. When her father died of a fever in 1876, she had taken over his contracts, and nobody at the land office had complained, because she was better at the work than he had been. Not because she was unkind about it, but because it was simply true. She had come west in 1879 after the federal government began offering survey contracts in the newly organized territories, and she had not gone back east since. There was something about the scale of the western landscape that appealed to some very basic part of her, the sheer size of it, the way a mountain range could be visible for 3 days' ride before you reached it. The absolute, unapologetic fact of the land, which did not care what anyone thought of it and went on being what it was regardless. She had stopped at a trading post a day's ride south of Dust Creek for water and supplies when she had heard the man behind the counter talking to another customer about the Calloway family. Rosa Calloway, he said, widow woman, been working that land since before her husband died of a snake bite 4 years back. Now some man named Hector Vane was claiming he had bought the property from her husband before he died, had a deed to prove it, and the county recorder had already accepted the filing. The problem, the man behind the counter said, was that everybody in 3 counties knew that Samuel Calloway had loved that land like it was a member of his own family, and there was not a soul alive who believed he had sold it without telling his wife, and not a soul alive who could prove it either way because Samuel Calloway was 3 years in the ground, and Hector Vane's deed was stamped and filed and perfectly, maddeningly legal. Lenora had stood at the counter and listened, and something in the story had caught on the part of her mind that she could never quite turn off, the part that noticed inconsistencies. The part that said, when someone hands you a document, the first thing you should ask is not what it says but whether it is telling the truth. She had asked the man at the trading post for directions to Dust Creek. She had met Rosa Calloway that same afternoon, in the small farmhouse that sat at the edge of a dry creek bed with a kitchen garden behind it, and a barn that had been painted and repainted with the kind of stubborn care that said the person tending it was not interested in letting anything go to ruin if they could help it. Rosa was a woman of perhaps 50, weathered and deliberate in her movements, with a daughter named Clara who was 22, and had her father's coloring and her mother's way of setting her jaw when something displeased her. They had offered Lenora coffee and flatbread, and she had sat at their kitchen table and looked at the copy of the deed that the county recorder's office had sent as official notice. She had looked at it for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she had said very quietly, "Where did you say Mr. Vane came from?" "Abilene," Clara had said, "or so the story goes, though Billy Marsh at the hardware store says he came through Reno first." "Has anyone else seen the original deed?" "Not a copy, the original document." Rosa and Clara had looked at each other. "Just the county recorder," Rosa had said. "Man named Peters. He's been in that position for about 2 years now." Lenora had folded the copy carefully and put it in her satchel, and she had told them she was going to Dust Creek to speak to the sheriff. Rosa had looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and resigned skepticism in equal parts, the expression of a woman who had already tried everything and had learned not to expect too much from anything new. "I will be back before sundown tomorrow," Lenora had said. "Do not let anyone on the property until I return." She had ridden into Dust Creek the following morning. The town was the kind of place that the railroad had come close to without quite reaching, which meant it had all the ambition of a boom town without the infrastructure to support it. Main Street was a 1/4 mile of storefronts, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a general store, a blacksmith, and the county land office, which shared a building with the post office and a dentist named Abe Holloway who did his best business on Friday afternoons when the ranching men came in from the outlying properties. The sheriff's office was at the end of the street next to the jail, and it was there that Lenora had gone first. She had not expected Graham Maddox. She was not sure what she had expected. She had been to enough frontier towns to know that a sheriff could be almost anything. A professional lawman, a retired soldier, a former outlaw who had switched sides, or simply the man who happened to be standing closest when someone needed to be shot at. She had dealt with all of them. She had learned to read the nature of a man in the first 30 seconds of meeting him, not because she was particularly intuitive, but because she had needed to, because traveling alone in the territories meant that knowing who you were dealing with was a survival skill. Graham Maddox was something different. She had registered it even as she was irritated by him. He was in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had been good-looking before the sun and weather had worked it over and turned it interesting. There were old scars on his right hand, the kind you got from work rather than from fighting, and the way he moved in his office, unhurried but never still, spoke of someone who had grown up physical and stayed that way. His dark hair was going silver at the temples, and when he was listening, really listening, he went completely quiet in a way that most people did not manage. He did not believe her. That much was absolutely clear. But he had given her 24 hours. She spent the first 3 of those hours at the land office. The county land office in Dust Creek was a narrow room behind the post office, presided over by a man named Gerald Peters, who had the careful manner of someone who was being very precise about not appearing nervous. He was perhaps 45, with soft hands and excellent penmanship. He brought out the original deed for the Calloway property with the kind of deliberate neutrality that Lenora recognized as performed indifference, the behavior of someone who has decided exactly what face to show the world before the world has a chance to ask. She took the deed and sat at the clerk's table with her leather satchel open beside her, and she went to work. The first thing she did was take out her jeweler's loupe, a small brass and glass magnifying lens on a hinged arm, and examine the paper. Not the writing, the paper itself. She was looking at the fiber composition, the texture of the weave, the way the surface had been treated. Paper manufactured before 1875 in the Western Territories had a specific characteristic quality to its fiber blend that she had cataloged carefully over years of handling original land documents. The paper on this deed was close, but not quite right. The fiber blend was slightly too uniform, which meant it had been made in the last 3 or 4 years, not the 8 that the deed's date claimed. The second thing she looked at was the ink. Ink aging was one of the more reliable methods of document examination, and it was one that most forgers either did not know about or did not know how to properly address. Fresh ink, even when chemically treated to appear older, retained a quality of surface adhesion that differed from truly aged ink in ways that were visible under magnification. The ink on this deed had been treated. She could see the attempt. Someone had used an oxidizing agent on it, probably a diluted solution of something acidic, to dry and crack the surface in a pattern that mimicked natural aging. But the cracking was too even. Natural aging cracked ink in irregular, branching patterns determined by temperature variation and humidity cycles. This cracking was too uniform along the pen strokes, which meant it had been applied after the writing was done rather than developing over time. She made a note in her journal. The third thing, and the most important, was the county seal. County seals in Nevada Territory were embossed, not printed. They were made with a physical die pressed into the paper, leaving a raised impression. Lenora had handled enough authentic Nevada land documents to know what the Dust Creek County seal looked like from 1874, which was the year the deed was supposedly executed. The impression on this deed was slightly too shallow, and the text around the outer ring had 2 letters that were fractionally misaligned in a way that the original die would never have produced, because once a die was made, the alignment was fixed. It was not the original die. It was a copy, and a very good copy, she would grant that much, but not good enough. She spent 2 more hours pulling comparison documents from the land office files, everything she could find that had been executed and filed in 1874, and she laid them out on the table and went through each of them systematically, building her case with the same methodical care she applied to survey measurements. Evidence was only useful when it was organized. Individual pieces could be argued away. A systematic body of comparison, properly documented, was much harder to dismiss. By the time she left the land office in the late afternoon, she had a complete case in her journal, and Gerald Peters had stopped looking at her with performed indifference and started looking at her with something else entirely. She cataloged that too, filed it away, and walked back down Main Street toward the sheriff's office. Graham Maddox was not there. His deputy, a young man named Walt Briggs who could not have been more than 23, told her the sheriff had gone out to check on a problem at the Dawson Ranch, 3 miles north of town, and would be back before dark. Lenora checked into the Dusk Creek Hotel, a 2-story frame building that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and ate a solitary dinner of beef stew and bread in the small dining room on the ground floor. She was tired, bone-deep tired, but it was the productive kind of tiredness that came after work well done, and underneath it she felt the familiar low hum of righteous anger that had been her companion for most of the day. She had seen this before. Not exactly this, but the shape of it. Land fraud was one of the oldest crimes in the Western Territories, and it was one of the most devastating because it was quiet. It did not look like violence from the outside. It looked like paperwork. It looked like legal proceedings and county records and duly filed documents. But it worked the way all property crimes worked. It took from the people who had built and maintained and invested their lives, and gave to the people who were clever and ruthless enough to exploit the systems meant to protect ownership. The Calloway family had done everything right. They had worked that land for 11 years. They had paid their taxes. They had survived drought and snakebite and the death of the man who had anchored the household. They had planted and harvested and painted and mended and stayed. And now someone was trying to take all of that from them with a piece of paper and a forged seal. She pushed her bowl away and opened her journal and went over her notes again, checking her logic, looking for holes. There were none. She was certain of what she had found. The question was whether she could convince Graham Maddox of it. He came to the hotel just as the last light was fading from the sky. She was sitting on the porch with her journal open in her lap when she saw him ride down Main Street, and she watched him dismount in front of the livery and lead his horse inside with the easy, practiced motion of a man who had been doing this same thing for years. He came out of the livery without the horse and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, looking up and down the street, and then his gaze found her on the hotel porch and he walked toward her. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her. "Deputy Briggs said you came by the office," he said. "I have completed my preliminary examination," she said. "I would like to walk you through my findings." He looked at her for a moment, and she watched him doing what she suspected was a habitual internal calibration, weighing her against whatever category he had placed her in when she had walked into his office that morning, deciding whether to revise the category or hold the line. "I have eaten this evening," he said. "Have you?" "I have." "Then come inside. There is a table in the hotel parlor." She followed him inside, and they sat across from each other at a small table in the parlor while the hotel proprietor, a woman named Elsa Gunderson, who was too professionally discreet to do anything more than set 2 cups of coffee in front of them and disappear, left them alone. Lenora opened her journal on the table between them and began. She did not ask him to believe her. She understood that asking a man like Graham Maddox to believe her was roughly the equivalent of asking the sun to rise in the west. What she did was show him the evidence, piece by piece, each one documented with a comparison example, and a technical explanation that she kept as clear and accessible as she could without talking down to him. She pointed out the paper fiber discrepancy. She explained the ink aging technique and showed him the pattern difference, drawing quick diagrams in the margin of her journal to illustrate what she meant. She explained the seal and the die, and she showed him the measurements she had made with her surveying compass of the letter spacing in the seal impression, compared to the measurements from 3 other documents she had found in the land office files that bore the authentic 1874 seal. She talked for 45 minutes without stopping. When she finished, there was a silence. Graham Maddox was looking at her journal, at the rows of measurements and the diagrams and the careful, cross-referenced notes. He had not spoken once during her presentation, which she had taken as a good sign. Men who were planning to dismiss you tended to interrupt. He reached across the table and picked up her journal, turning it to get better light from the lamp on the wall, and he studied the measurements she had made of the seal. He studied them for a long time. Then he set the journal back down. "You said 3 mistakes," he said. "You've shown me 3, the paper, the ink, and the seal. Yes. Any one of them alone might be coincidence or deterioration. Yes. All 3 together is not coincidence." "No," she said, "it is not." He sat back in his chair, and she watched the muscles in his jaw work, and she could see him doing a large, complicated internal calculation, the kind that involved not just the evidence she had presented, but everything it meant. If the deed was forged, then the county recorder had either been deceived or been complicit. If Peters had been complicit, then he had been complicit with Hector Vane, which meant Vane had resources and connections that went beyond simple land fraud. It meant the whole thing was bigger than one stolen farm, and it meant the machinery of it had already reached into the official apparatus of the county. "You know what you are telling me," he said. "I know exactly what I am telling you. If Peters is in this, then Vane has had help inside this county for long enough to set this up properly," Lenora said. "The filing date on the deed is 8 months ago. Someone spent time building this. They were patient about it." He was quiet again. She let the quiet sit there because she had made her case, and anything she added now was just noise. "How long have you been doing this work?" he asked finally. "Surveying, since I was 17. Document examination specifically, 9 years. Where did you train?" "My father taught me surveying." "The document examination I mostly taught myself, through working with the Department of the Interior and having access to a large enough body of authenticated documents to build comparison protocols from scratch." Something shifted in his expression. "You built the protocols yourself?" "The ones I use, yes. The department's standard protocols at the time were adequate for obvious forgeries. I found them insufficient for sophisticated ones." She paused. "Which is a thing I am telling you so you understand the basis for my confidence, not to impress you." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "You're very direct. I have found it saves time." He was quiet again, and this time the quality of the quiet was different. There was something in it that felt less like doubt and more like thought, and she recognized the difference because she had been in enough rooms with enough men to know what genuine consideration looked like when it was finally, reluctantly being offered. "What do you need from me?" he asked. She had not expected the question so quickly. She kept her expression neutral. "I need you to secure the original deed as evidence and prevent Peters from accessing the land office records overnight. I need someone to ride to the Calloway property and make sure Vane's men do not show up tomorrow morning. And I need you to look into the connection between Peters and Vane without alerting either of them. That's a considerable amount of work for one night. I am aware." He looked at her for another moment, and then he stood up and picked up his hat from the back of the chair. "I'll secure the deed tonight. Deputy Briggs can ride to the Calloway place at first light. Peters, I'll handle myself." He put his hat on. "Get some rest, Miss Langley. Tomorrow is going to be complicated." "It already is," she said. He walked toward the door, and then he stopped and turned back, and she looked up at him from the table, and there was something in his expression that was neither doubt nor pure professional regard, but something more complicated than either. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you just showed me took 9 years to learn and 45 minutes to explain in a way that made it impossible to dispute. That is not a small thing." He left before she could respond. She sat at the table in the hotel parlor for a long moment after he was gone, her journal open in front of her and the 2 cups of coffee gone cold, and she was aware of something unfamiliar settling in her chest. A kind of warmth that she was, if she was being strictly honest with herself, not entirely sure what to do with. She closed the journal and went to bed. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of a horse being ridden hard down Main Street, and she was at the window in time to see Walt Briggs heading north at a gallop in the direction of the Calloway property. Good. Maddox had moved quickly. By the time she had dressed and gone downstairs, it was still dark, and the town was quiet in the particular deep way that frontier towns went quiet at night. All the ordinary sounds of human activity stripped away and replaced by the wind and the occasional call of an animal from the darkness outside town. She ate the breakfast that Elsa Gunderson appeared to have prepared in anticipation of early rising guests, strong coffee and biscuits and salt pork, and she was reviewing her notes when Graham Maddox came through the hotel door at 5:30. He looked like a man who had not slept. "Peters ran," he said, sitting down across from her and accepting the cup of coffee she poured for him without comment on the familiarity of the gesture. She set the coffee pot down. "When?" "Sometime in the night. His rooms above the land office are empty and his horse is gone from the livery. He took a saddlebag of personal items but left most of his belongings, which means he moved fast when he moved. He knew I was examining the records," she said. "He saw me working. He must have sent word to Vane last night." Graham's hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, were steady, but she could see the tension in his forearms. "I sent a telegram to the county seat an hour ago, and another to the territorial marshal in Carson City. That was the right move. Is there anything else in the documents that would tell us more about Vane, who he's working with, where the money is coming from?" She had been thinking about this since 3 in the morning. "The deed names a witnessing attorney," she said, opening her journal to the page where she had transcribed the details. "A man named Carlton Drury with an address in Reno. That name appears on at least 3 other land deeds I found in the land office files from the last 2 years, all of them involving properties that had changed hands under circumstances that the previous owners apparently contested." He looked up sharply. "How many properties?" 3 others that I found. There may be more. I was working quickly." She turned the journal toward him so he could see the names and parcel numbers she had noted. "This is not a single crime, Sheriff Maddox. This is a pattern. Someone has been systematically targeting established homesteads and farms in this county, specifically properties that have been worked and improved, which makes them worth more than raw land, and using forged documents to transfer ownership. The quiet that followed was the kind that precedes a large, consequential decision." "How many families?" he said. "Based on what I found in the files last night, at least 4, including the Calloways, possibly more if the operation started before Peters was appointed county recorder." She paused. "When was Peters appointed?" 2 years ago. He came from Reno with a letter of recommendation from the territorial governor's office." She looked at him steadily. "Then the recommendation needs to be investigated too." He rubbed a hand over his face. The exhaustion was showing now, and underneath it something else, something that looked like anger, but the controlled kind, the kind that was being carefully managed and directed rather than running loose. She respected that more than she could easily say. She had known men who let anger drive them, and she had known men who used it as a tool. Maddox was the second kind. "I have a meeting this morning with 2 ranchers whose properties are on the list you just showed me," he said. "I'd like you to be present for it." She had not expected that. "To explain the document evidence." "Yes." He met her eyes. "And because they will need to hear it from someone who can explain it clearly, and right now, you are the best person for that." There was something in how he said it that was different from how it would have sounded 12 hours earlier, when he had been looking at her with that settled, impenetrable doubt. It was not just the words. It was the acknowledgement underneath them, the recognition of her as the most qualified person in the room for a specific, important task. She had been waiting for people to extend that recognition her entire professional life, and she had learned not to let the relief of it show too plainly when it came, because it tended to make the moment about her reaction rather than the work at hand. "I will be there," she said. The meeting took place at 10 in the morning in the sheriff's office. with two ranchers named Harvey Croft and Dade Morrison seated across the desk from Graham, while Lenora stood to one side and walked them through the same evidence she had shown Graham the night before. This time, with the original land deeds for their respective properties pulled from the files for comparison. Harvey Croft was 60 and had the careful, measuring way of a man who had made it this far in life by not trusting anything too quickly, and he sat through her explanation with his arms folded, and his eyes moving from her face to the documents and back with something that started as skepticism and shifted, piece by piece, into outright alarm. Dade Morrison was younger, 35 perhaps, with a temper that sat visibly close to the surface, and halfway through her explanation, he had stood up from his chair and needed Graham's firm hand on his shoulder to sit back down. She kept going. The evidence was the evidence, and it said the same thing regardless of how the room felt about it. When she finished, Harvey Croft said in a very quiet voice, "My deed for the East Pasture. It was filed 18 months ago after that business with the title dispute. I thought it was all sorted out." "I need to examine that deed," Lenora said. "Can you bring it to me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, with the weight of a man who is beginning to understand how much trouble he is in. Dade Morrison looked at Graham and said, "What are you going to do about Vane?" "I am going to find him," Graham said, "and when I do, I am going to arrest him. But right now, what I need from both of you is for you to stay on your properties and let no one onto them without my say-so. Keep your deeds somewhere safe. Do not go after Vane yourselves." The look Morrison gave him suggested that staying calm was not his first preference, but he held it, and the two men left the office with the careful, deliberate movements of people who have just been told the ground they are standing on may not belong to them. Graham closed the door and turned to Lenora. "Drury," he said, "the witnessing attorney in Reno. I need someone to go to Reno. You can't go yourself if Vane comes back through here while you're gone, no. I need to send word to the territorial marshal." He paused. "But I need the case laid out clearly before they arrive. A clear, documented account of the fraud method, the comparison evidence, and the properties affected. Something that can stand up to a legal challenge." She looked at him. "You want me to prepare that?" "You're the only one who can," he said, "not as an appeal, as a statement of fact given simply and without calculation." She thought about her original contract in Carson City, the survey work that was technically due to be completed within the next 3 weeks. She thought about Rosa Calloway's face when she had sat across from her at the kitchen table. She thought about the other families, the Croft East Pasture, the Morrison property, whoever else might be on a list they had not finished finding yet. "I will prepare the documentation," she said. "It will take me the rest of today and probably most of tomorrow morning. I will make sure you have everything you need." They worked separately for the next several hours, Graham sending telegrams and conducting interviews around town, while Lenora took over the table in the hotel parlor and spread her papers and the comparison documents across it, in a system that she had developed over years of producing legal-grade authentication reports. She moved through it with focused, mechanical efficiency, writing in the careful, precise hand she used for official documents, building the case layer by layer, each piece of evidence cataloged and cross-referenced, and tied to the specific statutory provisions that governed land title authenticity in the Nevada Territory. By late afternoon, her neck ached and her fingers were cramped, and she needed fresh air with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from hours of close focus in a confined space. She put on her jacket and went outside and walked down to the end of Main Street and back, and on the return she passed the sheriff's office and saw through the window that the lamp was still lit and Graham was at his desk with papers spread out in front of him. She hesitated on the boardwalk. She had done this her whole professional life. The careful management of her own warmth toward the people she worked alongside, the precise regulation of the line between professional collaboration and something with more personal charge. She had learned to manage it because she had learned, sometimes painfully, that the line mattered and that crossing it at the wrong moment or with the wrong person had consequences that fell harder on her than on the man involved. But she looked through the window at Graham Maddox at his desk, and she was honest enough with herself to notice that something about him was pulling at her in a way she had not felt in a long time. Not just the look of him, though she was not indifferent to that. It was the way he had shifted. The way the doubt had come down not all at once but piece by piece, as she showed him the evidence, and the way it had been replaced not by embarrassment or by the overcompensating enthusiasm of a man covering for having been wrong, but by something quieter and more substantial. Respect, plain and uncalculated. She was not sure he even knew he was showing it. She pushed the door open. He looked up, and something in his face settled in a way she was not sure she could describe. "I thought you'd gone to sleep," he said. "I needed air." She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk. "Have you heard anything from Carson City? Territorial Marshal is sending a deputy in 2 days. He wants the documentation by the time they arrive." He leaned back in his chair. "You will have it ready by tomorrow noon." He looked at her. "You've been at this since first light." "Yes, and before that you rode 2 days to get here. That is the nature of the work." "Do you always push this hard?" She considered the question. "When it matters, yes." "What made you stop at that trading post?" he said. "When you heard about the Callaways, you had a contract to finish. You could have ridden straight on." It was a genuine question. She could hear it. "Because someone was going to lose their home over a lie made of paper," she said. "And I was, at that particular moment, the person most qualified to do something about it. Choosing not to would have been a choice too. I just don't make that one." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on his desk threw a warm, unsteady light across the papers between them and the planes of his face, and outside the night wind had come up, carrying the smell of dust and sage through the crack under the door. "I owe you an apology," he said. She had not expected that. "For when you came in yesterday morning." He paused, and she could see him being precise about this, choosing his words the way he seemed to choose everything, deliberately. "I made a judgment before I had the evidence. I told myself it was professional skepticism. It was not entirely that." The honesty of it was so clean and so unpretentious that she felt it more than she wanted to. "I know," she said quietly. "You have been navigating that your whole career." "Yes. And you are better at the work than most men I know." "Better than most men I know too," she said, and she meant it without arrogance, just as the flat statement of a fact that had been demonstrated repeatedly across 9 years. "Though I could name 2 or 3 who would give me a real argument for the title." He almost smiled. "I believe you." The silence between them now was different from every silence that had preceded it. It had warmth in it and a kind of careful alertness on both sides, the quality of 2 people who are becoming aware of each other at the same time and neither of whom is quite sure what to do about it, and both of whom have, for different reasons, learned to be cautious. "Tell me something about the work," he said. "Not the fraud, just the regular work, the surveying." She looked at him for a moment, surprised. "Why?" "Because you've been talking about evidence and legal statute for 2 days, and I want to hear you talk about something you love." The directness of it landed like a stone dropped into still water. She made herself keep her expression even. "You are very observant," she said. "It is a job requirement." She thought for a moment. "When you survey a piece of land," she said, "you start from a known point, a benchmark, something you can locate precisely in relation to every other known point in the system, and from there you measure outward, distance and angle, each measurement building on the last, and by the end of it you have a picture, not just of the land but of its relationship to everything around it, where it fits in the larger shape." She paused. "There is something very satisfying about that, about being able to say exactly where a thing is in the world." He was watching her with an attention that was entirely different from the watching he had done when she had been presenting her evidence. That had been analytical. This was something more personal, something that seemed to see more of her than just the professional competence she had been demonstrating. "You like precision," he said. "I like truth," she said. "Precision is just the method I use to find it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said quite simply, I'm glad you stopped at that trading post." She felt the warmth in her chest again, stronger this time, and she let herself feel it rather than managing it away. "So am I," she said. She stood up and said goodnight and walked back to the hotel, and she was aware, as she went, that something had shifted between them in a way that had nothing to do with documents or evidence or land fraud, and that she was going to need to think carefully about what to do with that awareness. She filed it alongside everything else that was important, under things to attend to when the immediate crisis was resolved. The next 36 hours were the kind that aged a person. The territorial marshal's deputy arrived earlier than expected, a lean and efficient man named Cole Harker, who had the manner of someone who had seen too many frontier frauds to be surprised by this one, but was willing to be thorough about it. Lenora presented her documentation to him in a 3-hour session at the hotel table, and he worked through it with focused attention and very few questions, which she took as the sign of a man who understood what he was reading. Graham handled the arrival of Hector Vane. Vane came to Dusk Creek on the second morning after Peters had fled, which Lenora thought showed either considerable nerve or a fundamental miscalculation of how much the situation had changed since his Confederate ran. He was a broad man in expensive clothes who had the surface ease of someone who expected to be believed, and he came into town with 2 armed men and an attorney riding behind him, which said he had been warned that something had gone wrong but had not been told exactly how badly. He went to the sheriff's office. He came out of the sheriff's office 40 minutes later under arrest. The attorney stayed behind and made a great deal of noise about habeas corpus and the integrity of duly filed instruments of title, and Deputy Harker presented him with Lenora's authentication report and the comparison analysis and the 3 pages of statutory reference. And after approximately 10 minutes of reading, the attorney became very quiet and asked for a glass of water. Peters was found 2 days later in Winnemucca, trying to buy passage on a freight wagon heading for California. He was returned to Dusk Creek and placed in the jail, and when Deputy Harker sat down with him for 4 hours and laid out exactly what the evidence showed, Peters cooperated in a way that suggested he had been frightened enough of Vane to go along with the scheme, and was now more frightened of the territorial legal system than of Vane. He gave them Carlton, Drury, and Reno. He gave them the names of 2 county recorders in adjacent counties who had been running variations of the same scheme. He gave them, most importantly, the complete list of properties that had been targeted, including 3 more that Lenora had not found in the land office files, because the filings had been made in adjacent counties under different names. It was a systematic, carefully organized fraud operation that had been running for 3 years and had successfully dispossessed 2 families already. A retired farmer named Gus Hawkins, who had sold his property and moved on without realizing the sale had been coerced by threats he had not connected to the forged paperwork, and a Mexican-American couple named Delgado who had lost their property during a period of illness and had not had the resources to contest the transfer effectively. Lenora added their names to her report and included a specific recommendation that the territorial authorities pursue restoration of their properties, with the same urgency being applied to the current cases. Graham read that part of her report and then looked at her across the hotel table and said, "You added them." "Of course I added them," she said. "The fact that the crime was successfully completed against them does not make it less of a crime." He was quiet for a moment. "The territorial authorities may not prioritize it. Then we push until they do." She met his eyes. "The Delgados have the same right to their land as the Callaways." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see that he agreed with her completely and was also thinking about the political realities of a territorial system that had demonstrated repeatedly and clearly that it applied its justice in ways that were shaped by power and by who was seen as deserving protection. "I'll add my recommendation to yours," he said. "As the sheriff of record in this county, it will carry more weight." "Thank you," she said. "It's the right thing." "Yes," she said, "it is." 2 days after Vane's arrest, with the immediate legal storm beginning to settle into the slower machinery of territorial court proceedings, Lenora sat with Rosa Calloway and Clara on the porch of the farmhouse by the dry creek bed in the afternoon light, and Rosa said, simply and without any particular ceremony, "Thank you," and Lenora said, "I am glad I could help." And that was all that needed to be said about it. She should have been packing to leave. She had a survey contract to complete in Carson City. She had a professional life organized around motion, around the next contract and the next territory and the next set of measurements to take. She had been moving for 9 years, and she had built something she was proud of in that motion, a body of work and a reputation, and a set of skills that she had made entirely on her own terms, and that belonged to no one but herself. She was aware, as she rode back toward Dusk Creek that afternoon, that she was not in a particular hurry to leave. Graham found her in the hotel parlor that evening, which had become a habit that neither of them had formally acknowledged or formally decided to discontinue. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the hotel kitchen, which had also become a habit, and he sat down across from her and set a cup in front of her and said, without preamble, "Harker is leaving tomorrow morning. He'll take Vane and Peters back to Carson City for the territorial proceedings." "I know," she said. "He spoke with me this afternoon. Your report is the centerpiece of the prosecution's case." "Good. That is what it was built to be." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "When are you leaving?" She looked at him. "I have a survey contract in Carson City. I have been out of schedule for nearly a week." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anyone in Carson City who is waiting for you to come back? Anyone in particular?" She understood the question. She answered it honestly. "No," she said. "There is not." Another quiet. The lamp on the wall was doing its usual work, and outside the night wind was doing its usual work, and Main Street had gone through its evening routine and settled into the late quiet that Lenora had come to recognize as its particular sound. "I have been the sheriff of Dusk Creek for 4 years," Graham said. "I came here from Wyoming." After he paused. "After a situation that I thought I could manage and turned out to be somewhat larger than I had calculated." He looked at his coffee cup. "I stayed because there was work to do here and because leaving felt like giving up on something I had not yet finished." She waited. "In 4 years," he said, "I have met a great many people. I have not met anyone quite like you." He looked up at her. "And I am aware that is a statement that could easily be read as something either very ordinary or very specific, and I want you to know that I mean it in the very specific sense." Her heart was doing something against her ribs that she had not authorized it to do. She kept her hands around her coffee cup and her voice level. "Graham," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name, and she saw him register it. "I am a woman who lives on the road. I have a tent and a surveying kit and a leather satchel, and for 9 years that has been enough. I am not," she paused, searching for the honest version. "I am not someone who stops." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to stop." He met her eyes directly with the full, unhurried attention that she had come to recognize as one of the most characteristic things about him. "I am just telling you that if you ever came back through Dusk Creek for any reason, I would be glad of it." She looked at him for a long time. "I have the Delgado case to follow up on," she said carefully. "The territorial authorities are going to need someone to examine the property records in the adjacent counties where the other filings were made, someone with document examination experience." "Yes," he said, "they are. That work would require someone to be in and out of this county for," she considered, "several months possibly." "That seems like a reasonable estimate," he said. And now there was something in his voice that was warm and careful and very precisely restrained, matching her own tone exactly. And she had the sudden clear sense that she was talking to someone who understood the conversation she was trying to have and was meeting her exactly where she was standing. "I would need to complete the Carson City contract first," she said. "Of course." But after that she looked at him. "I think there is significant unfinished work in this county." He looked back at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way it had been doing, the almost smile that she had been cataloging from the very first day. "I think you're probably right," he said. She left Dusk Creek 2 days later. riding southwest toward Carson City with her leather satchel and her compass, and her journal full of evidence and notes, and the detailed case she had built against Hector Vane and his network of land fraud. She had said goodbye to Rosa and Clara Calloway that morning, and to Deputy Briggs, who had shaken her hand with the enthusiastic gratitude of a young man who had just watched someone do something remarkable and was still marveling at it, and to Elsa Gunderson at the hotel, who had pressed a jar of preserved peaches into her saddlebag without explanation and refused to discuss it. Graham had walked her to the livery. They had stood outside it in the early morning light, when the air in Dusk Creek was still cool and the sky was doing the thing it did over the desert, going from gray to gold to blue in a span of 20 minutes that always seemed too fast to properly see, and he had looked at her with that full, steady attention and said, "The work you did here mattered. The Calloways will keep their land," she said. "That is what matters." "It mattered to me too," he said, "personally, not just the case." She looked at him. The light was coming across his face at an angle that showed the lines around his eyes and the silver at his temples and the solid, undeniable fact of him, standing in front of her with his whole, honest self entirely visible, and making no attempt to be anything other than what he was. She thought about precision, about measuring outward from a known point, about the relationship between things being at least as important as the things themselves. She stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw briefly, and he went very still. "I will be back in 6 weeks," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She mounted her horse and rode out of Dusk Creek and did not look back, because she had found, in her experience, that looking back while you were still moving forward was a reliable way to go in the wrong direction. She completed the Carson City survey in 38 days, which was 2 days faster than her original schedule, because she had come back from Dusk Creek with the particular focused energy of someone who has an appointment to keep. She sent her report to the Department of the Interior and filed her invoices with the Federal Land Office and wrote to Deputy Harker in Carson City, asking for an update on the Vane prosecution and the status of the Delgado property claim, and she packed her saddlebags and rode east. She arrived in Dusk Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the desert had gone cool and dry, and the sky was the flat, brilliant blue of winter coming on, and she rode down Main Street past the general store and the church and the blacksmith and the hotel, and she stopped her horse in front of the sheriff's office and swung down from the saddle. The door opened before she reached it. Graham Maddox stood in the doorway with a look on his face that she was going to be thinking about for the rest of her life, the look of a man who had told himself, repeatedly and with complete conviction, that he was prepared for this moment and was finding, now that it had arrived, that being prepared and being ready were two entirely different things. "You're 2 days early," he said. "I know," she said. "I rode faster." He stepped back to let her in, and she came through the door of the sheriff's office that she had walked out of 7 weeks ago with her case under her arm and his doubt at her back, and she set her satchel on the chair across from his desk and turned to face him in the afternoon light. "The Vane prosecution is proceeding," she said. "Harker has a complete case. The Calloway deed has been invalidated, and Rosa's original title has been reestablished by the territorial court. The Croft and Morrison properties are confirmed clear." She paused. "The Delgado case is going to require more work. There are jurisdictional complications with the adjacent county filings. I have the documentation ready, but someone is going to need to present it in person at the next Territorial Land Commission session in Carson City." "I assumed you would do that," he said. "I will," she said, "but I will need the case files from your office to support my testimony." "They're ready," he said. "I have been organizing them." He paused. "I have also found 2 more properties in the records that I think may have been targeted by Drury's network before Peters was appointed recorder. I need your eyes on the documents." "Show me," she said. They spent the next 3 hours at his desk, going through the files he had assembled, and she had not been so thoroughly absorbed in work in weeks, and at some point between the 3rd file and the 4th, the lamp was lit because the afternoon had turned to evening, and at some point after that the work was done for the night and they were still sitting across from each other at the desk. "Have you eaten?" he said. "No." "Then let me take you to dinner," he said, not as the sheriff and the document examiner. As he paused, choosing his words with the deliberateness she had come to expect from him and to appreciate deeply. "As a man who has been thinking about you for 6 weeks and would like to have dinner with you." She looked at him, and she felt the full weight of the warmth she had been carrying since the first time she had sat across from him in this hotel parlor and watched his doubt become respect, and she let herself feel it completely, without the careful management she had been applying to it for most of her adult life. "I would like that very much," she said. They ate at the hotel dining room, at a table by the window, and they talked for 2 hours without once discussing land fraud or forged documents or territorial court proceedings. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia with a father who used a surveying compass the way other men used a pocket watch, checking it constantly and deriving the same reassurance from it. He told her about growing up in Wyoming on a cattle ranch that his parents had homesteaded, and that he had left at 17 to work as a surveyor's assistant, which made her look at him with open surprise, and he smiled the real smile, the full one that she had been waiting to see since the first day, and said, "You are not the only person at this table who knows which end of a theodolite to look through." She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that came from genuine surprise and genuine delight, and it felt so uncomplicated and clean that she was almost startled by it. "You surveyed," she said, "for 3 years in Wyoming, then 2 years in Colorado. Then I made some poor choices involving a cattle theft ring I thought I could dismantle by myself, and the result of that was I ended up as a deputy sheriff in Cheyenne, which eventually became a sheriff's badge in Dusk Creek, Nevada. Was there a family involved? In the cattle theft ring?" He looked at her steadily. "There was a woman who told me she needed my help and meant something else by it entirely. It ended badly for several people, none of them me, which is a thing I have always felt more guilty about than I probably needed to." He paused. "She is remarried and living in Denver, last I heard, which I know because I made it my business to know, to make sure she was all right." Lenora looked at him across the table. The lamplight was doing the same warm, unsteady work it always did in this room, and outside the November night was cold and clear, and inside there was the smell of coffee and warm bread and wood smoke and the quiet that had, she thought, been slowly filling with something worth having. "You checked on her," she said. "Yes. That is a very decent thing to do." It felt like the minimum. She leaned forward slightly across the table. "Graham," she said, "I want to say something that is perhaps slightly more forward than I would usually be with a man at dinner." He met her eyes. "Please," he said. "I came back to Dusk Creek because there is real work here that needs doing. That is the truth. But I also came back because of you. And I would like to know, plainly, whether the feeling you spoke of when I left is still something you intend to pursue, or whether 6 weeks of absence has clarified things for you in the other direction." He held her gaze with the full, unhurried attention she had come to know as his most characteristic quality. "6 weeks of absence clarified nothing in the other direction," he said. "It clarified things considerably in the first direction." "Good," she said. "Then I believe we have an understanding." "I believe we do," he said. They walked back along Main Street after dinner in the cold, clear night, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked the length of the street at the kind of unhurried pace that said neither of them was in any particular hurry to arrive anywhere. At the door of the hotel, she stopped and turned to face him. He was looking at her with the full directness that she thought was probably the thing she would always love most about him, the complete absence of calculation in the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to have decided that she was someone worth seeing clearly, and was making no effort to see anything other than exactly what was there. He kissed her, briefly, and with the kind of care that said he was taking nothing for granted, and she kissed him back with the kind of certainty that said she was. "Good night, Lenora," he said. "Good night, Graham," she said. She went inside, And for the first time in 9 years, she went to sleep in a frontier town feeling something other than the solitary satisfaction of work done well. She felt the beginning of something. Specifically, she felt the beginning of the kind of something that she had spent years moving too fast to catch. She was not sure she was going to outride this one. She was not sure she wanted to. The winter in Dust Creek was cold and clear and the driest anyone could remember, and Lenora stayed. She had not planned to precisely. She had planned to work through the Delgado case and the secondary document examinations that Graham's research had turned up, and to travel to Carson City in January for the Territorial Land Commission session, where she would present the evidence against the Drury Network. All of that was true. All of that was genuine work that needed doing. But she also stayed because, for the first time in her professional life, she found that moving on was not the first thing she wanted to do when a piece of work was finished. She set up a working space in the back room of the sheriff's office, which Graham offered with a directness that made it clear he was aware of exactly what the offer meant and was making it anyway. She borrowed a larger table from Elsa Gunderson at the hotel and brought in her survey maps and her document comparison materials and her reference volumes. And she built the kind of orderly, functional workspace that she had always created in transit, except that this one was not in transit. This one was in a specific place, in a specific building, next to a specific office where a specific man worked through his days with a methodical competence that she found, day by day, more admirable rather than less. They were careful with each other in the first weeks, the way two people who have spent their lives being self-sufficient tend to be when they first begin to let someone else close. There were moments of friction, because they were both opinionated people who had strong ideas about how to do things correctly, and because Graham had 4 years of established process in this county that did not always align with Lenora's ideas about how a case should be assembled. They argued twice, calmly and with mutual respect and without resolution, and both times the argument turned out to be more about the general principle than the specific point, and both times they ended up, when they had talked long enough, having agreed to something better than either of their original positions. She found that deeply satisfying. She had never been sure she wanted a partner. She was finding that she had been wrong about that specifically, and that what she had been right about was that she did not want a particular kind of partner, the kind who needed her to be less in order to be comfortable. Graham Maddox was not that kind. He went to church on Sundays. She did not, but she walked with him to the door and waited on the steps outside, and they walked back afterward. And the town saw this happening and drew its conclusions, and those conclusions were, on the whole, warm. Rosa Calloway drove into town one Wednesday in December and spent an afternoon with Lenora, going over the testimony she was being asked to provide for the territorial court, and when she left, she squeezed Lenora's hand at the livery and looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who has survived enough to know what is worth observing. "He looks at you," Rosa said, "the way my Samuel used to look at the land in spring." Lenora rode to Carson City in January for the Land Commission session. She stood before the Territorial Land Commission for 4 hours and presented the most complete forensic case for document fraud that any of them had seen from a private examiner, which she knew because 3 of the 5 commissioners said so. Separately, and with the kind of stunned acknowledgement that she had learned to accept gracefully, and without either false modesty or visible satisfaction, because both of those were distracting. The commission formally invalidated the Drury Network deeds in 2 counties and opened proceedings for a 3rd. The Delgado family's property claim was formally reinstated on the 4th day of the session. Their names were read into the territorial record. Lenora was in the room when it happened, and she sat very still through it, and she felt something that was connected to the anger she had been carrying since she had first read their names in Peters's files, but softer. The satisfaction of a wrong beginning to be set right, which was not the same as the wrong being erased, but was real and significant and worth sitting quietly with. She rode back to Dust Creek. Graham was waiting at the edge of town on horseback, which was so unlike him, so uncalculated and uncharacteristic and exactly what she needed to see, that she pulled her horse to a stop and laughed at him affectionately. "You rode out to meet me," she said. "I heard you were coming back today," he said. "How?" "I sent a telegram to the commission office yesterday asking for the outcome, and they wired back the results and mentioned you would be leaving this morning." He brought his horse alongside hers. "The Delgados. Reinstated," she said. Something crossed his face, clear and unguarded. "Good," he said, very quietly, with the weight of a man saying the only right word for the thing he feels. They rode back into town side by side in the January cold, with the desert going purple in the late afternoon light, and the first stars already visible low in the east. And Lenora thought about benchmarks and known points and measuring outward, and about how the surveys she had always loved best were the ones where you found, at the end of all the measuring, that the shape of the land was larger and more interesting than the map had suggested. He proposed to her in February. Not with a great deal of ceremony, because he was not a man of great ceremony, but with the full deliberateness and clarity that characterized everything he did. He had ridden out to where she was completing a boundary survey on the Morrison property, 3 miles north of town, and he had sat on his horse and watched her work for a while, the way he sometimes did when he was nearby and she was in the field, and then he had dismounted and stood beside her while she packed up her surveying instruments. "I want to ask you something," he said. She finished securing the theodolite in its case. "Ask." "I know that your life is built around motion," he said. "I know that you have a career that takes you across the territory, and that takes you away from any fixed point for weeks and months at a time. I am not asking you to give that up. I would not ask that, and I don't think you would accept it if I did." He paused. "But I am asking whether, when the motion brings you back this way, which I believe it will because the work here is real and ongoing, you would be willing to come back to a home that was yours as much as mine." She looked at him standing in the winter light of the Nevada territory, with the dry mountains behind him and the Morrison property's fence line running out to the west, and she thought about 9 years of useful, honorable work done entirely on her own terms, and she thought about the specific quality of satisfaction she had found in this county, and she thought, quite clearly and without doubt, that the known point she had been measuring outward from for all those years had been waiting for something to complete the benchmark. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." They were married in April, in the Dust Creek Church, on a Saturday morning when the desert was doing the thing it did in spring, going green and vivid in a way that happened for exactly 3 weeks and then was gone. Rosa and Clara Calloway were there. Harvey Croft was there with his wife. Dade Morrison came and brought his family. Walt Briggs stood up as the best man, which he did with the enthusiastic propriety of a young man who was taking the responsibility very seriously. Elsa Gunderson brought a cake and refused to discuss where she had found the ingredients. Deputy Harker rode down from Carson City specifically for the occasion, which touched Lenora more than she expected, and he shook her hand after the ceremony and said, "Your report is still being cited in every major land fraud prosecution in this territory," which was, she thought, about the best wedding gift a document examiner could receive. Lenora kept her survey contracts. She had been right that the work was ongoing and would continue to bring her through the Nevada territory and beyond. And Graham had been right that he was not asking her to change the shape of her professional life. What changed was that the motion had a center now, a place that pulled her back with the reliable attraction of something worth returning to. She was away for weeks at a time, and she came home, and when she came home, there was a man who made coffee and listened to what she had found and asked the right questions, and who was, in her absence, doing his own work with his own quiet competence. She came home from a survey contract in eastern Nevada in the summer of that first year, to find that Graham had been in correspondence with the Territorial Land Commission about establishing a formal document examination protocol for the county, based on the methods she had developed and used in the Vane case. He had written to the Department of the Interior asking them to formally endorse her authentication procedures as a standard for land deed verification in the Nevada Territory. He had done this without telling her, and he told her about it over dinner with the particular straight-faced neutrality of a man who has done something he knows is going to matter to someone and is trying very hard not to seem pleased about himself. She put her fork down and looked at him. "You submitted my protocols to the Department of the Interior," she said. "I did, as a proposed territorial standard." "Yes, without telling me. I wanted to see if they would respond." He paused. "They responded. What did they say?" He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded letter, which he set on the table between them with the care of someone handling something he considered important. She opened it. The Department of the Interior, Territorial Land Division, was pleased to inform the Dusk Creek County Sheriff's Office that the document authentication protocols submitted for review had been accepted as a model methodology for land deed verification and would be circulated to territorial land offices in Nevada, Colorado, and the Utah Territory for implementation. Her name was on the letter. Lenora Langley Maddox, document examiner. She read it twice and set it down on the table. "Graham," she said. "Yes." "This is," she stopped. She was, for once in her professional life, not in possession of a precise word for what she wanted to say. "This is a very significant thing." "I know," he said, simply and without performance. She looked across the table at him, at this man who had doubted her on day one, and had sat across from her in this same hotel dining room and been unable to argue with her evidence, and had accepted the thing the evidence told him, and had apologized for the doubt, and had spent the months since then doing everything in his power to make sure the work she had done was recognized as the serious, significant contribution it was. She thought about the trading post south of town where she had heard Rosa Calloway's story and turned her horse toward Dusk Creek, and she thought about how the series of choices that had brought her to this table were a line she could trace backward from here, clear and logical and precise, the way a good survey line always was. "Thank you," she said. "The work earned it," he said. "I just sent the letter." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and the dinner went on around the lamp, and the autumn wind, and the particular quiet of a Dusk Creek evening with nobody in it but the two of them and the life they were building. Their son was born in the spring of 1884. They named him Samuel for Rosa Calloway's husband, which was Lenora's idea and which Graham accepted immediately without requiring an explanation. Samuel arrived in the world with his father's coloring and his mother's particular alert intensity of expression, which was clear from about the second week of his life, when he began looking at everything around him with a focused, analytical attention that made Elsa Gunderson laugh and say, "That child is already measuring things." Lenora took her first survey contract after Samuel was born when he was 3 months old, a 2-week assignment south of Reno, and she and Graham had a long and honest conversation about what the arrangements needed to look like going forward, the kind of conversation that required both of them to say clearly what they needed and what they could offer, without softening either for the sake of the other. Walt Briggs, who had become part of the household in the indefinite, useful way of a loyal deputy, could keep an eye on things in the evenings. Rosa Calloway, who had appointed herself something between a neighbor and an honorary family member, was nearby. Graham had the clear-eyed practicality of a man who had made himself self-sufficient before he had anyone to be self-sufficient for, and saw no reason to stop. She went to Reno and did the work and came back in 12 days instead of 14. And Samuel looked at her when she came through the door with the same focused intensity he directed at everything, and then recognized her and broke into the unambiguous, whole-body joy that very small children use when they have not yet learned to be careful with their happiness. And she held him and felt the particular, irreducible weight of him. The specific solid fact of a person who was partly her and partly Graham and entirely himself, and thought, Benchmark. The Vane prosecution concluded in the territorial court in the fall of 1884. Hector Vane received a sentence of 6 years in the territorial penitentiary. Carlton Drury in Reno received 8 years, the additional time being accounted for by the judge as recognition that Drury, as the attorney who had provided the legal architecture for the scheme, bore a particular responsibility for the systematic nature of the fraud. Gerald Peters received 2 years, reduced from 4 in exchange for his cooperation as a witness. Lenora was not present for the sentencing. She was on a survey contract in Colorado. Graham sent her a telegram. She read it twice, standing in a surveyor's office in Denver with the October snow coming down outside the window, and she sent back a single word: good. She was in Dust Creek for Christmas, and they sat together in the house they had built on the east side of town, with Samuel asleep and the wood stove doing its warm, steady work, and Graham read aloud from a letter he had received from Deputy Harker, who was now the territorial marshal, saying that the Delgado family had resumed working their property, and that Senor Delgado had sent a formal letter of thanks to the Dust Creek Sheriff's Office, and specifically to the document examiner whose report had made the restitution possible. Graham read the letter through once and then looked at her across the table. "He names you," he said, "by name." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the winter desert was doing its cold, still, breathtaking thing, and inside the house it was warm and smelled of pine from the green boughs that Clara Calloway had brought over that afternoon, and Samuel was asleep in the next room with the deep, total unconsciousness of a child who has no reason to be anything other than entirely at peace. "I am glad," she said, and she was. Completely and fully and without qualification she was. She thought about the day she had ridden into Dust Creek for the first time, dusty and direct, and carrying a case, she was certain of inside a county, that had not yet decided what to do with her certainty. She thought about the deed on the desk, and the doubt in those gray eyes, and the 45 minutes she had spent dismantling that doubt piece by piece, not for the satisfaction of dismantling it, but because the Calloway family needed someone to, and she was the person most qualified to do it. She thought about the moment Graham had looked up from her journal, from her rows of measurements and her cross-reference comparisons, and said things she could not argue with and had meant it without qualification. The moment he had seen her, she reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his palm up and held on, the way he always did. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I rode into this county because someone was trying to take a family's land with a forged piece of paper," she said. "And I have no regrets about that, and I would do it again, and I intend to keep doing work like it for as long as the work needs doing." "I know," he said. "But the life I found here," she said, "while I was doing that work, that was not something I was looking for. And it is." She looked at him steadily, with the same precision she brought to everything that mattered. "It is the most significant thing I have found in the Nevada Territory, and I have found some genuinely significant things in the Nevada Territory." He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention that had never stopped being one of the things she loved most about him. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said, with the simple directness of a man who is stating a fact rather than performing a sentiment. "I know," she said. He laughed, the real laugh, and she laughed with him. And outside the winter desert held the cold and the stars and the particular, vast silence of a landscape that did not need anyone's approval to be what it was. And inside the house in Dust Creek, Nevada, in the winter of 1884, Lenora Langley Maddox and Graham Maddox sat together in the warm light of everything they had built, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. In the spring of 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Rosa, because some debts of gratitude were best kept close, and because the name suited her, and because when Rosa Calloway held the baby on the porch of the farmhouse by the dry creek and looked down at her with the expression of someone seeing something they had not expected to be given, Lenora thought that there were some kinds of rightness that did not require any explanation at all. Samuel was 14 months old and deeply skeptical of the new arrival for approximately 3 days, and then was won over by the absolute fact of her, in the way that older siblings have always been won over, by the specific, undeniable presence of a person who has arrived and is clearly not going anywhere. Lenora completed the last of the Drury Network documentation in the summer of 1885. A final set of comparison analyses for the adjacent county cases that the territorial court needed to close the remaining proceedings. She did the work at her table in the back room of the sheriff's office, which was still her primary workspace when she was in Dusk Creek, and she did it with Samuel at her feet and Rosa in a crate beside the table and Graham moving through his office next door with the familiar, steady rhythm of his working days. She finished the last page and set her pen down and looked at it. It was the complete work, not just the Vane case or the Calloway deed, all of it. The whole connected body of a fraud network that had been systematically stealing land from people who had built lives on it, laid out in documented, cross-referenced, legally unambiguous terms that would stand in any territorial court in the West. It was some of the best work of her professional life. She picked Samuel up from the floor, where he had been engaged in an experimental relationship with a page she had dropped, and she carried him through the door into the main office and set him on Graham's desk. Graham looked up from the letter he was writing with the expression of a man who has come to understand that certain things in his office now simply happen without prior arrangement, and who has no objection to this. "It's finished," she said. He looked at her. "All of it, all of it." He set his pen down and looked at the stack of documents she had brought through with her, and then he looked at her with the full attention, and she saw in his face the specific expression that she had been seeing for more than 2 years now, the one that was not just professional regard and not just love in the simple sense of the word, but the combination of both, the recognition of her as fully herself in all the specific, particular dimensions of what that meant. "What do you want to do next?" he said. She thought about it. There were new contracts available through the Department of the Interior. There was a large survey assignment in Oregon that she had been asked to tender for, a significant federal project that would take 6 months and would be the largest single commission of her career. There was ongoing work in the Nevada Territory. There was always ongoing work. "I want to go to Oregon," she said. "I want to take the federal survey contract, and I want to come back here when it's done." "Then do that," he said simply, as he always did. She looked at her son on his desk and her daughter in the crate by the door and her husband with his letter and his badge and his uncomplicated, unhesitating belief in everything she was, and she thought, "This is the known point. This is the benchmark I measure from now." And then she went back to her table and picked up her pen, because there was still work to do, and there always would be, and that was the most satisfying part of all. The Oregon contract was completed in 7 months, and she came home to Dust Creek in the early spring of 1886 with a finished survey that the Department of the Interior described in their acknowledgement letter as the most precise, large-scale territorial survey completed in the Pacific Northwest since the boundary surveys of the 1860s. She came home to a husband who met her at the livery and 2 children who had both grown in ways that surprised her, because that was what children did, and to a house that smelled of coffee and pine and the specific, irreplaceable smell of the life she had made, which was the best thing she had ever surveyed and the only one she never needed to measure twice. Graham had expanded the sheriff's office while she was gone, adding a second room that he had built himself with help from Harvey Croft and Dade Morrison and Walt Briggs over 3 Saturdays in the fall. He said nothing about it until she walked into the office the morning after she got home and found it there, a bright room with good natural light and a new large table and empty shelves along one wall. "For the document examination work," he said, "when you're here." She stood in the new room and looked at the shelves and the table and the light coming through the new window, And she thought about all the temporary workspaces she had set up and packed away over 9 years of traveling. And she thought about what it meant to have a permanent one, built by the hands of the man who loved her in the town that had become her center. She turned around to face him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms folded and his expression careful and patient, waiting for her response the way he always waited, without pushing. "It's perfect," she said. And she meant it about the room, and she meant it about all of it, the whole complicated, precise, fully surveyed shape of the life they had built together in the Nevada Territory, in the town of Dust Creek, in the good and useful years of the 1880s West, where the land was large and the work was real, and the truth, when you found the right methods to locate it, was always worth the trouble of the finding.